He was hunting elk. Instead, he found a heartbeat buried in blood and snow. A young wolfdog, limbs twisted in rusted steel, eyes wild with fear, but alive. No one else came. No one else cared. But he did. Jack Whitaker, a man trained to pull the trigger, chose mercy instead. He broke the trap. He carried the beast, and that choice lit a fuse that would awaken the entire mountain. A pack, a woman, a war for the wild, and a bond that defied everything we thought we knew about wolves and men. What happened next will haunt you, heal you, and change how you see loyalty forever. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe in compassion, in redemption, and that even a lone wolf deserves a second chance, hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't just a rescue story. This is a resurrection. The wind clawed across the upper ridges of the Bighorn Mountains, dragging snow through the pines in thick, bitter spirals. Wyoming in late November was not for the fragile. Even by mountain standards, it was a hard day. Gray sky pressed close to the earth, the air dry as bone, and the scent of coming snow sharp enough to taste. The trails had gone quiet. Not even the elk moved. Jack Whitaker trudged through the underbrush in silence, boots crunching ice-laced pine needles. He moved like he belonged there, tall, broad-shouldered, with a rifle slung low across his back and a leather-bound satchel on his hip. His face was weather-worn, skin browned and lined from wind and years, framed by a thick gray beard. Eyes sharp, jaw set, he looked like someone the world had tried and failed to break. At 52, Jack was no longer a man seeking anything. He lived in quiet refusal. Once a decorated Marine, then a husband and father, now just a hunter who'd built a life of shadows and routine deep in the wilderness. The crash had taken them, his wife, Dana, and little boy Noah, 6 winters ago on a slick highway west of Sheridan. Since then, Jack had chosen silence and snow over the noise of towns or grief. He was hunting today, but not for sport. This was for food. He followed a game trail uphill through wind-polished stones and frosted roots, eyes scanning the terrain with mechanical calm. Then, a sound cut through the stillness. Subtle, irregular. Not the heavy step of elk or the chatter of birds, but something smaller, desperate. A whimper. Jack stopped cold. He turned his head slowly, gaze narrowing toward a gnarled cluster of snow-laden spruce a dozen yards ahead. The sound came again. Wet, weak. The scratch of something trapped. He stepped off the trail, pushing through the low branches, snow dusting his jacket. What he saw made him freeze mid-breath. A young animal lay curled in the churned snow, its body trembling, one leg twisted unnaturally inside a rusted steel trap. Muzzle narrow, ears sharp. Definitely not a dog. Its coat was a wild mixture of silver-gray, ash-black, and faint gold along the flanks. Eyes, striking amber, watched him warily, full of both pain and something deeper. Not just fear. Defiance. A wolf dog. Jack crouched slowly, his voice low, controlled. Easy now. The hybrid didn't growl, didn't snarl. It only flinched when he reached toward the trap, bloodied snow crusting the metal teeth. The trap was old, illegal, untagged, a relic of poachers who never cared for what they caught. Jack pulled a pry bar from his satchel, braced it against the frozen ground, and, with quiet strength, forced the trap's jaws open. It snapped wide. The animal yelped once and collapsed. The leg was bleeding and swollen, but not shattered. With practiced hands, Jack wrapped it in gauze, checked the pulse, light, but holding. He lifted the wolf dog into his arms, lighter than expected, starved, likely less than a year old. "All right, boy," he muttered. "You're not dying out here." He turned back toward his cabin, another half-mile through worsening wind. The cabin stood against a granite outcrop, half hidden by frost-covered trees. Smoke curled weakly from its chimney. Jack kicked the snow from his boots and shouldered the door open into the familiar scent of pine wood, ash, and old leather. Inside was spare but functional. A cot, shelves lined with canned food and bullets, a map of the Bighorns pinned to one wall, and a heavy wood stove now flickering with fresh flame. He laid the Wolfdog onto a folded wool blanket beside the stove, stoked the fire, then stood over the animal a long moment. Up close, its coat was thick but mangled, fur dulled with grime. The creature looked up at him, not with submission, but acknowledgement. Jack had seen that look before. Soldiers with wounds they didn't understand, who refused to die simply because they were told they should. "You're not just wild," he said quietly. "You're stubborn." He boiled elk broth, spooning a few warm drops into the Wolfdog's mouth. The animal stirred, swallowed weakly. Jack exhaled for the first time in hours, letting his shoulders fall. He sat back against the wall, letting the fire warm his stiff legs. Snow tapped gently against the windows. The wilderness outside shrieked its winter song, but inside there was only the ticking of heat and the slow, rasping breath of survival. He needed to call the animal something. He remembered a name his son once whispered while reading under the blanket on stormy nights. "Greywind," Jack said aloud. The Wolfdog's ears twitched. Far from Jack's cabin, across a white valley draped in silence, another figure trudged through the snow. Clara Monroe, 45, pulled her hood tighter as wind bit at her cheeks. She was tall, with a lean, athletic build and a presence that mixed authority with quiet warmth. Her auburn brown hair, threaded with a few early grays, was tied into a braid beneath her ranger cap. A biologist by training, she had spent 2 decades tracking wolf behavior across the Rockies. Her olive jacket bore the patch of the University of Montana's Wildlife Research Program. Clara had come to the Bighorns to study a local wolf pack whose movements had turned erratic in recent weeks. Young dispersals missing, trails suddenly cold. Tonight she was checking her trail cameras, one strapped to a low pine just above a ridge. It had stopped transmitting the night before. She crouched beside it, wiped frost from the lens, and retrieved the memory card. Back at camp, she would discover that the last image it recorded was strange. A juvenile wolfdog staggering out of frame, injured, blood on the snow, and what looked like boot prints not far behind. Clara narrowed her eyes toward the northern horizon. Smoke, faint but visible, rose between the trees. "Someone's out here," she murmured, "and they just changed everything." Snow pressed softly against the cabin windows like a ghost trying to speak. Inside the fire in the cast-iron stove hissed with sap from pine logs, the only light in the warm wooden space where Jack Whitaker sat at his table, coat draped over the back of his chair, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. Outside, the wind had died down, replaced by the slow hush of falling flakes that coated the forest in white silence. But inside, something else stirred. Greywind lay curled on the folded blanket by the stove, his wounded leg still wrapped but less inflamed. Jack had redressed the wound that morning, checked his vitals, and spooned out another helping of broth, which the animal had only sniffed before turning his head. It wasn't rejection, it was fear. The kind that didn't fade with food or warmth. That night, Jack was drifting between thoughts of his son's favorite storybooks and the sound of the old stovepipe creaking in the rafters when a sharp bark startled him upright. Greywind was on his feet, or trying to be his good front leg, extended, his body, trembling fangs bared at the front door, as if something invisible lingered beyond it. A low growl rolled from his chest. Jack stood, calmly set the rifle aside, and approached. "There's nothing out there," he said softly. "Just wind and your memories." But Greywind didn't stop. He barked again once, short and sharp, then staggered forward, front paws slipping on the wood floor as he limped toward the door. His hind leg collapsed before he reached it. Jack stepped forward, knelt beside him. "You're not ready to go back into that wild," he muttered. "Trust me, I've been out there too." Greywind huffed, ears twitching. Jack sat beside him, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then, unexpectedly, Greywind lowered his head, pressed his muzzle gently against the back of Jack's calloused hand. It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was contact willing and without fear. Jack didn't speak. He just let the warmth settle in his fingers, the weight of the animal's breath against his skin. The moment passed quietly, but something shifted in the cabin that night. For the first time, Jack wasn't just a man caring for a broken animal. He was being trusted. Miles away, dawn was just brushing the treetops in rose gold when Clara Monroe stepped lightly through a narrow ravine, her snow boots sinking into the drifted earth with soft crunches. Her breath formed clouds that trailed behind her in the morning chill. She wore a forest green parka over a faded gray fleece binoculars swinging against her chest and a GPS unit strapped to her wrist. Her gait was confident but cautious. She had been out since sunrise, following what the memory card from the camera had captured an injured Wolfdog, limping westward, then disappearing. Clara had a practiced eye, and years of tracking wolves across the northern Rockies had sharpened every instinct. What unsettled her now wasn't just the missing juvenile, it was the human boot prints visible in the snow near where the blood trail ended. Now she moved with greater care, her eyes on the ground. Just up the ridge from her past, a curved outcrop, she found something unexpected. A crumpled strip of white gauze with dried blood on it. It was the kind used in emergency field wraps, not something wildlife would leave behind. She crouched and inspected it, brushing off ice. Human intervention. Next to the gauze, tucked beneath a snow-dusted root, were footprints heavy-set, booted, and recent. They moved northward in the direction of Smoke Hollow. Clara stood, brows furrowing. "Someone helped it," she whispered. She reached for her notebook and scribbled a quick log entry. Clara was methodical, sharp, and principled. Her career had been built on quiet observation, but this wasn't about research anymore. This was interaction. Someone was disrupting the natural course, but in a way that didn't fit poaching or trapping. Someone had saved a wolf dog and kept it. She looked up at the ridgeline where a faint trail of smoke curled into the cold air. It could be a trapper's cabin, or something else. She wouldn't confront, not yet. Clara didn't believe in jumping into a puzzle without knowing all the edges. But she knew enough to file a report, document the behavior, and return with questions. For now, she whispered to the quiet woods, "Let's see where this goes." Back in the cabin, Jack had cleaned up the morning broth Greywind refused. He wasn't surprised. The animal had eaten little over the last 2 days, only small sips of water and occasional nibbles. But it wasn't starvation that worried Jack, it was fear. The kind of fear that tightened every muscle before a storm, the kind he used to see in new soldiers before their first firefight. Later that afternoon, while outside shoveling snow from the roof's edge, Jack heard scratching behind the door. He rushed in, heart briefly seizing with the thought of injury. But no Greywind was on 3 legs, dragging himself slowly toward the door again. This time he didn't growl. He just stood there, chest-heaving, gaze focused beyond the wood. "You miss it out there," Jack said from behind him, "even with a shattered leg." Greywind didn't turn. He pressed his paw softly against the wood, not clawing, just pressing like memory lived in the grain. Jack sighed. "You'll go back one day, but not yet." That night, for the first time, Greywind accepted food straight from Jack's hand. Not much, a few bites of cooked venison, but enough to show he'd chosen to stay, at least for now. The storm came with little warning, just a shift in the wind, a sudden stillness in the trees, and then the sky collapsed in sheets of snow. Jack Whitaker stood on the edge of the eastern ridge, the collar of his coat turned up against the rising wind, Eyes narrowed as the trail ahead vanished under powder. Behind him, Greywind moved cautiously, his gait more sure now, though his left hind leg still favored the ground lightly with each step. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the Wolfdog had first limped into Jack's life. The once starved, wary creature had gained weight, his coat had filled out with a winter sheen of silver gray and black, and his demeanor had shifted from survival-driven panic to a kind of watchful loyalty. Not obedience, never that, but alignment, a mutual rhythm Jack hadn't shared with another living soul in years. Jack's original plan had been simple: retrieve the game traps he'd set 2 days earlier along the old snare line south of the basin. But the storm's sudden arrival had complicated things. He and Greywind had already turned back when the first crack of a rifle echoed through the trees. It wasn't a hunter's shot. Not careful. Not clean. This was rapid, reckless fire panic or pursuit. Jack ducked instinctively, raising his binoculars and scanning the tree line below. Through the snowfall, shadows moved, figures in dark parkas weaving through the pines. Too fast, too scattered. Not locals. He focused and saw one, clearly a tall man with a camo jacket and a semi-automatic slung over his shoulder, shouting to someone off-trail. At his hip hung a netted bag, fur and motion. Poachers. Jack's jaw clenched. He whispered, "Damn idiots." Greywind, sensing tension, stood alert, ears sharp and body low. 3 figures came into view now, moving up toward the narrow pass that curved along the ridge's edge close to Jack's property. They were pushing something ahead of them, another animal wounded. Jack couldn't see clearly, but the way it stumbled fought against a snare line. It was young, probably a fox or small wolf, likely destined for black market sale. Jack turned to Greywind, voice low. "I need you quiet now, partner." He circled wide through the trees, keeping cover. But as he reached the far edge of the ridge, a branch snapped beneath his foot. The nearest poacher turned, raising his weapon. "Hey, Jack," ducked behind a boulder as a shot rang out, sending bark splinters into the air. A second later, a blur of gray muscle exploded from the tree line. Greywind. The Wolfdog moved like smoke and lightning, ears, flat teeth bared, body coiled for precision, not blood. He didn't leap to kill. He charged with force, barking sharp and primal. The lead poacher stumbled back, tripped, and his rifle flew into the snow. Another man turned, tried to swing the butt of a shotgun, but Greywind darted low and snapped his jaws inches from the man's leg, enough to cause fear, not harm. Jack stepped out from behind the boulder, rifle raised, voice like thunder. "Drop it! Now!" The third man, shorter, with a crooked beanie and mismatched gloves, hesitated too long. Jack fired not at him, but inches from his boot. The man dropped his weapon immediately. The 3 of them stood, frozen hands up, pale faces ghosted by snow. Jack kept the barrel aimed. "You've got 10 seconds to leave the mountain. You come back, I report you. And don't think I don't know the tags you're using aren't legal." The one in the camo jacket muttered something under his breath, but backed away. Greywind stayed between them, and Jack, hackles raised but unmoving. By the time the men disappeared into the trees, dragging their broken pride behind them, the snow had begun to thicken again. Jack knelt by the trap they'd left behind inside it, a young pine marten, barely breathing. He opened the rusted spring, freed the animal, and wrapped it loosely in a scarf from his coat before tucking it into his pack. Then he turned to Greywind. The Wolfdog stood panting but not aggressive, just alert, shoulders squared. "You didn't go for blood," Jack said. "You just made them run." Greywind blinked, then sat. Not far off downwind, a figure crouched silently behind a snow-dusted outcrop, watching. Clara Monroe had been following the trail since dawn, faint paw prints that didn't match any known pack combined with blood trails near a den she'd tagged months ago. She'd watched the confrontation from a distance, her binoculars pressed against her eyes. What she saw had stopped her breath. A young Wolfdog, clearly once injured, had charged 3 armed men, held them off, then stopped without attacking. She didn't need to guess who the man was. She recognized him now, Jack Whitaker, the reclusive veteran and part-time guide known to avoid town unless absolutely necessary. No one thought much of him. Until now. Clara slowly lowered her binoculars. The way the Wolfdog responded to him, it wasn't just training. It was something older, instinctive, mutual. She wrote one line in her field notebook. Subject is no longer wild. Subject has chosen. She paused, then drew a small arrow beside it and wrote, "But chosen what?" The moon hung low and full over the Bighorn wilderness, its pale glow washing the snow-covered ridges in silver. From Jack Whitaker's cabin, the world looked unreal quiet, still the kind of silence that made even breath feel too loud. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Greywind had grown restless. Each night over the past week, the Wolfdog had waited until the stove embers dimmed and Jack's breath steadied in sleep before slipping silently to the door. At first, Jack had thought it was coincidence the creature simply needed air or still bore instinct to patrol. But by the fourth night, Jack noticed a pattern. Greywind didn't just step outside. He vanished. That night, Jack pretended to sleep, eyes half-lidded beneath the shadow of his cap. At midnight, Greywind rose, stretched, and with one backward glance toward his companion, nosed the cabin door open and trotted into the darkness. Jack waited a full minute, then grabbed his coat, slung his Winchester over his shoulder, and stepped into the night. The snow crunched beneath his boots, but he moved quietly, following the paw prints already being swallowed by wind. The air was thin and sharp moonlight streaking across the treetops. He moved without a lamp, trusting the light above and the memory of the terrain. It didn't take long. A quarter-mile from the cabin just beyond the frozen creek that marked the border of Jack's land, the prints slowed. Jack crouched behind a ridge of fallen trees and saw them shapes shifting in the moonlight shadows with fur and muscle and yellow eyes glowing like sparks in the snow. A pack. 6, maybe 7 wolves stood loosely gathered in a clearing between the trees. Their posture wasn't aggressive. No growls, no defensive stances. Instead, they circled and sniffed a smaller form in their midst. Greywind, his body low to the ground, tail held straight, not submissive, not dominant. Familiar. Jack watched heart tight. Greywind wasn't attacking. He wasn't afraid. He belonged. The largest of the wolves, a tall black and silver male with a deep scar across one shoulder, stepped forward, brushing his muzzle gently against Greywind's neck. Greywind licked back once, then sat beside the wolf. Jack's hand tightened on the rifle sling, not from fear, but something deeper grief he didn't quite understand. Minutes passed. Then the wolves lifted their heads in unison and let loose a low, mournful howl that shook the trees. Greywind joined in his voice, clear, raw, and ancient. Jack felt it in his chest, a chord plucked from some long-buried instrument of emotion. He didn't move. He just listened. Eventually, the wolves turned, melted back into the trees. Greywind lingered a moment longer, then followed, but not far. Before the pack disappeared into the ridgeline, he looked back. Toward Jack. Toward home. The next morning, Clara Monroe adjusted the lens on her motion-triggered trail camera, half buried under the branches of a fir tree. She wore her usual ranger green parka, a knitted scarf her sister had made, and her insulated gloves now patched with duct tape from overuse. Her breath came in tight clouds as she reviewed the memory card on her field tablet. The footage was short, just 12 seconds time-stamped from the night before. A figure human stood in the middle of a snow-drenched clearing surrounded by wolves. Not threatened, not attacked, just there. She rewound, froze the frame. The face wasn't clear, but the stance was familiar. Tall, firm, with that unmistakable military posture. Whitaker. Clara stood in the middle of the trail, blinking hard. This wasn't just behavior change in a wolf dog. This was something else, something rare. Integration, trust. Even wild wolves didn't accept outsiders easily, and certainly not humans. She packed her equipment and started toward the North Ridge. If Jack Whitaker was standing in the middle of a wolf pack without a scratch, she needed to talk to him. Not just as a biologist, as someone who'd spent her whole career believing there were limits to human-animal connection and now saw them being rewritten in a frozen clearing under moonlight. By dusk, Jack had returned from checking the traps he'd never gotten to the day before. The pine marten he'd rescued had been released near the creek, and the other traps, thankfully, were empty. But his thoughts weren't on snares or snow. They were on the way Greywind had looked back at him last night. Not like a pet. Not like a stranger. Like kin. Greywind now lay on the porch, his body stretched across the boards, one ear turned toward the woods. His movements were calm, still alert, always alert, but at peace. Jack stepped past him, sat on the other end of the porch, and lit a small cedar pipe he only brought out on nights like this. He didn't speak. Neither did Greywind. But the silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. Just down the slope, Clara reached the last bend before Jack's property. She paused, adjusted her scarf, and stepped forward. The fog rolled in low across the pine ridges, heavy with cold and silence. It swallowed the trails, softened the edges of trees, and turned the early morning forest into a quiet, floating world. Jack Whitaker moved through it with caution boots sinking into damp soil as he followed Greywind's tracks up a narrow game path just north of his cabin. The wolf dog had slipped out before dawn, and something in Jack's gut told him this morning was different. He walked with deliberate steps, his rifle strapped across his back coat, drawn tight against the chill. The mountain air was colder than usual, heavy with moisture, and every few feet Jack had to pause to find the next paw print. He wasn't tracking to chase. Not anymore. He was just following. Greywind had earned his space. Still, Jack had noticed the animal acting oddly the past few nights, tense when returning, sniffing at his own fur as though something clung to it. Jack wasn't one to assume, but he'd seen enough strange things in his life to know when instinct warned you. Something was off. He stepped through a thicket of frost-crusted firs and stopped. Ahead, the fog parted just enough to reveal a shallow meadow where snow had melted back in patches, exposing the frozen earth. And standing in the clearing, partially silhouetted by the mist, was Clara Monroe. She wore her forest green field jacket with a thermal vest layered underneath faded jeans and her long chestnut hair tied into a braid that trailed down her shoulder. A compact pair of binoculars hung from her neck, and a field notebook peeked from one side pocket. Her posture was alert but not aggressive. Feet planted firmly gloved hands relaxed at her sides. Her eyes, a sharp hazel green, met his the moment he stepped into view. They stood across from one another, separated by 15 feet, and a quiet that felt like miles. Jack said nothing at first. Clara didn't either. It was Greywind who broke the tension. The wolf dog trotted into view from the other end of the clearing, tail raised in recognition when he saw Jack, but then veered toward Clara, sniffing the air before circling back with a low chuff of breath. Clara took a small step back but didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on Jack. "I've been following him," she said at last, her voice calm and clear. "And I think you have too." Jack didn't move. "You're the biologist from Montana." Clara nodded. "And you're the reclusive hunter from the ridge who's apparently made peace with a wild animal." "He's not wild," Jack said, eyes narrowing slightly. "Not anymore." Clara's brow lifted. "Then what is he?" "Something in between." There was no sarcasm in his voice, just weariness and truth. Clara exhaled softly, fog leaving her lips. She slowly pulled her notebook from her pocket and held it up, flipping to a page with hand-drawn notes and sketches of fur patterns. "I've been collecting hair samples near the dens. Some of the wolves, especially 2 juveniles, had traces of a chemical on their coats. Synthetic, man-made, possibly a tranquilizer or tagging compound, and not from me. Jack frowned. You think someone's testing on them? I think someone's trying to control them. Or track them. Maybe worse. Jack looked down at Greywind, who now lay near his boots, licking at one of his front paws. I noticed him scratching, Jack said quietly. Thought it was fleas or snow mites. But last night, he smelled like something sterile. Like a clinic. Clara nodded slowly, her expression tightening. You're not the only one who's noticed. I saw a drone 2 nights ago. Small. Silent. Trained on the ridge. No government markings. Jack looked up sharply. This isn't just about wolves anymore, is it? No, Clara said. But he, she gestured gently to Greywind, might be the key to figuring out what's really going on. They stood in silence again, the mist curling around their boots. Jack finally broke it. I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to live my life, and he nodded at Greywind. Deserves to choose his. Clara's voice softened. Then maybe we help each other. I won't interfere with you or him, but I need to know who's interfering with them. Jack studied her face for a moment, measuring, not distrusting. Clara's eyes didn't lie. She was tired but clear, not chasing credit. Just answers. He gave a slight nod. You'll need to move quietly. I always do. She tucked the notebook away. Jack turned to leave, but Clara called softly after him. Jack. He paused. You've got a good animal there. He's not just surviving. He's bridging 2 worlds. Jack didn't turn, but there was something softer in his posture as he said, So am I. That night, Clara returned to her field tent deeper in the woods and examined the synthetic fibers she'd collected from a trap site. Under a field microscope, the compounds glowed faintly blue under UV light. It wasn't any standard wildlife tranquilizer she'd worked with before. She made a new entry in her journal. Subject Greywind, hybrid with confirmed link to Wildpack. Displays advanced behavioral adaptation, non-aggressive under threat. Unconfirmed evidence of synthetic exposure. Will observe further, avoid direct disruption. She sat back and stared at the ceiling of her tent. Out in the trees, a howl rose, deep rolling, not wild but purposeful. Not alone. The snow fell in thick, swirling curtains as midnight pulled its cold fingers through the forest. Wind clawed at the pines, the drifts whispering secrets in every hollow. Jack Whitaker stood at the edge of a narrow ravine known as Stone Pass, a steep-sided gash in the mountain where the rocks rose like black ribs from the earth. He held his breath as he scanned the darkness below. The sound of a low, muffled whimper had brought him here. That and Greywind. The Wolfdog stood at his side, his ears forward, body taut with tension. His coat shimmered faintly in the moonlight, now darker with mud and pine soot, leaner from running, but his amber eyes burned with urgency. He had dragged Jack from the cabin an hour earlier, barking once sharply, then running toward the northern ridgeline. Jack hadn't needed more of a signal than that. He'd grabbed his rifle and followed. Now beside them, Clara Monroe crouched low beneath a thicket of snow-crusted ferns, her breath short from the hike. She wore her field parka layered beneath a charcoal windbreaker, and a small sidearm rested holstered at her hip, a precaution she rarely used, but had strapped on since discovering the tampered traps in Sector 3. Clara squinted through a pair of thermal binoculars. Movement. 3 men, she whispered. They're surrounding something. Cages, I think. I see at least 2 animals inside. Jack leaned close. How far? 40 yards. Downhill. Behind that ridge. Greywind gave a low growl. Jack recognized the men instantly. He'd seen their type before, sloppy, posture-careless footwork, but armed and overconfident. Not local hunters. These were traffickers. Not just poachers, but handlers. They didn't hunt for food. They hunted for sale. As Clara adjusted the focus, she added, "I think they tagged the wolves with chemical tracers. Look." She held up a UV flashlight casting a violet beam toward the clearing. Faint glows reflected from the wolves' fur. "Same signature as the compound I found on Greywind. This is their operation." Jack didn't answer. His jaw was tight. Then he spoke softly. "We go in. Quiet. Fast." Clara hesitated. "If they have night vision or motion sensors?" "They don't," Jack said flatly. "They're not that smart. They're greedy." He turned to Greywind, knelt, and whispered, "Find the cage. Distract if needed. Don't fight unless you have to." Greywind didn't wait. He vanished down the slope, his body low and silent in the snow. Down below, a heavy-set man in a camo jacket with torn sleeves and a beanie too small for his head stood near a metal kennel laughing as he kicked the bars. "Stupid mutt bit me," he said. His name was Rex Vaughn, a former rodeo brawler turned animal trafficker known for his fists more than his brains. His face was rough with old bruises, and he carried a sawed-off shotgun slung across his shoulder like a toy. Beside him, two other men, Clay and Jonas, both lean and twitchy younger by a decade, were busy securing sedated wolves into a pickup with a custom crate box mounted to the bed. Then, everything changed. A sharp bark erupted from the far side of the glade. Greywind launched from the darkness, circling the cages, teeth bared but precise. He didn't attack. He ran just close enough to draw attention to force confusion. What the Vaughn turned raised his shotgun. Jack's voice cracked through the trees like a rifle bolt. "Drop it!" All three men spun around. Jack emerged from the slope above rifle-aimed stance rooted. "Move away from the cages. Now!" "Hell no," Vaughn barked. "This ain't your land." Clara stepped out beside Jack, voice calm but fierce. "This is federal land, and you're in violation of at least 5 wildlife protection statutes." "Lady, I don't care about statutes." He raised the shotgun. Then Greywind moved. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He lunged directly into Vaughn's leg, slamming into him before the trigger could be pulled. The shotgun went off one wild blast into the trees, and then a second crack split the night. Jonas had drawn a pistol. Jack fired first. The younger man yelped and dropped his weapon. His hand struck not fatally. Clay ran. Vaughn staggered to his feet, blood on his lip, and swung the shotgun toward Jack again, but Greywind was faster. He lunged once more, this time aiming high. The second shot hit. Not Jack. Greywind. The Wolfdog cried out and tumbled into the snow. Jack roared and fired this time at Vaughn's feet. The big man collapsed, winded, dropped the weapon, and lay groaning. The forest fell still. 10 minutes later, Clara had zip-tied the men's hands behind their backs with the field restraint she carried in her medical kit. Jack crouched beside Greywind, cradling the animal's head in his lap. The bullet had torn across Greywind's shoulder, not a direct hit, but deep enough to bleed heavily. "He took it for me," Jack said, voice rough. Clara's hands moved with urgency as she packed gauze against the wound. "He's not going to die. You got here fast. You pulled him back fast." Jack looked at her. "That's not instinct. That's choice." Clara nodded silently. Overhead, the clouds shifted. Snow began to fall again, light but steady. The wolves in the cages were alert now, not drugged but groggy. Clara moved to free them while Jack tended to Greywind. When she returned breathless and streaked with mud, she said, "I sent the coordinates and images to the Wildlife Protection Task Force. They'll send a team by morning." The man behind all this, Vaughn, runs a breeding facility 20 miles south. Unlicensed, private land. But now we have enough to shut it down. Jack looked down at Greywind, whose eyes blinked slowly but stayed fixed on him. "Then let's finish this." The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting an amber glow against the log walls of Jack Whitaker's cabin. Outside, the wind had quieted and the snow no longer fell, just drifted gentle and lazy under the weight of a sky scraped clean by stars. Inside, it was warmer than it had been in days. Greywind lay stretched on the wool rug by the stove, wrapped in a soft, patched quilt Clara had brought from her field tent. His bandaged shoulder rose and fell with shallow but steady breaths. It had been 4 days since the standoff at Stone Pass. 4 days of dressing wounds, feeding with care, checking vitals by firelight. Jack hadn't left the cabin except to fetch firewood or draw water from the creek. Clara had stayed nearby in her tent, keeping notes, bringing field antibiotics, and wordlessly watching over them both. That night, Jack sat in his old armchair, boots off legs outstretched, watching the flames. His hands were idle for once, no rifle to clean, no snare wire to fix. Just the slow rhythm of Greywind breathing and the occasional shifting of wood in the firebox. Clara leaned against the cabin's inner wall, arms crossed over her flannel, her long braid damp from melted snow. "His fever's down," she said. Jack nodded. "His eyes are clearer too. He should pull through." Jack's jaw tensed, then relaxed. "He always does." Clara glanced down, then added, "He didn't just survive that night. He made a choice." Jack met her gaze. "So did we." A silence passed between them. Not heavy, but meaningful. It was the first time either had said "we" without bracing against it. Later that evening, after Clara had stepped outside to check the trail cams near the tree line, Jack rose and opened the front door. The cold swept in like a memory. He stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching on the frosted boards. Greywind stirred behind him but didn't rise. The woods were utterly still. And then movement. From the trees, dark shapes emerged like mist given form. Wolves. 5 of them, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight, their bodies moving silently across the snow. At the front was the same scarred alpha male Jack had seen before, the one who had touched Greywind's muzzle under the moon. The pack came within 30 feet of the porch, then stopped. They made no sound. No growls, no warning barks. They simply stood watching. Jack remained still, arms at his sides. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call out. Inside, Greywind slowly rose and limped to the doorway. He stepped past Jack down onto the first step and stood tall despite the wound. He locked eyes with the alpha, his ears twitching once. No one moved for a long moment. Then the alpha turned his head slightly, looked once more at Jack, then back to Greywind. The pack turned in unison, silent as ghosts, and disappeared into the trees. No challenge. No blood. No sound. Acceptance. Greywind sat slowly on the snow-covered step ears, upright gaze following them until the forest swallowed them whole. Then without a word, he turned and limped back inside, curling again on the rug without a sound. The next morning, Clara received an email through her field tablet. Poor signal delayed delivery, but it came through clearly. The header read, "Montana Institute for Wildlife Preservation. Formal invitation to relocate research program." The message was long and politely worded, offering her a fully funded research position back east, of permanent lab team grants and opportunities to publish in multiple journals. A dream 5 years ago. She stared at it in silence for a long time. Then she closed it without replying. Instead, she opened her journal and wrote Day 63. Hybrid subject, Greywind status wounded but recovering. Notable behavior pack interaction confirmed. Pack returned displayed non-aggressive acknowledgement of human host. Implication: transcendence of traditional pack human boundaries, possible under unique behavioral development. Personal note: I'm not going anywhere. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She placed the journal down and stood stretching her arms overhead as sunlight streamed through the tent seams. Later that afternoon, she joined Jack on the ridge above the frozen creek. Greywind lay beside them, eyes closed but alert head rising every time the wind shifted. Jack didn't speak for a while. Then finally he said, "You think they'll come back?" Clara shrugged. "Maybe, but I don't think they need to." Jack turned to look at her. "Why not?" "Because they said everything last night." Jack looked back at the trees, his expression unreadable. But when he exhaled, it came out easier than it had in months. "They did, didn't they?" Clara smiled gently. Sometimes silence is the loudest kind of trust. The first snow of the season came without wind. It fell gently through the boughs of the tall pines, covering the forest floor in a soft white hush. Each flake sparkled briefly before settling into silence. From the porch of the cabin, tucked along the edge of Bighorn's wilderness, Jack Whitaker watched the world disappear beneath a blanket of peace. He sat with a mug of coffee, now lukewarm, cupped in his hands. His beard had grown thicker over the past month, touched with frost at the edges, and his shoulders relaxed beneath the worn wool sweater Clara had handed him weeks ago when he refused to admit he was cold. The rifle no longer sat within arm's reach. It was inside, unloaded, tucked beside a crate of books. At his feet, Greywind, rested nose tucked beneath his good leg tail, coiled around him like a protective loop. His shoulder still bore the scar from the bullet, but the wound had long since closed. His eyes, once wild and haunted, now drifted half-closed with contentment. He didn't stir at the distant sound of a raven overhead or the crunch of snow under approaching boots. Clara Monroe stepped onto the porch with a thermos under one arm and a thin manila folder in the other. Her cheeks were pink from the cold strands of chestnut hair tucked behind her ears. She wore her usual insulated parka over a faded university hoodie and a scarf she'd knitted herself last spring. She handed Jack the folder with a wry smile. "They came back from printing," she said. "It's ready." Jack opened the folder. Inside were several full-color photo proofs. One caught his eye immediately. Greywind standing at the forest's edge, framed between shadow and sunlight, with Jack's silhouette just visible in the background. "That one," she said, pointing. "I used it as the centerpiece. You really named it Between Wild and Kindness." "I did," she said, sitting beside him. "People liked it, said it felt like something real." The gallery was being hosted in Missoula, sponsored by a regional conservation nonprofit. Clara had spent the past month curating the photos she'd taken over the year, images of the wild pack of Greywind, of the brief, remarkable standoff at Stone Pass. But it wasn't about spectacle, it was about connection. One photo in particular had captured the attention of the organizers. Greywind lying in the snow beside Jack's boots, while the scarred alpha wolf watched from the tree line. Neither advancing, neither retreating, just being. "They'll ask questions," Jack muttered. "They should," Clara replied. "But they don't need answers. Just the truth." Inside the cabin, a laptop rested open on the desk near the stove. The screen displayed a blinking cursor beside a title in bold font, "Mercy of the Gray," a life between silence and snow. Jack had begun writing it at Clara's urging, though he never admitted it aloud. It wasn't a memoir, not really. It was a reckoning, a story of pain, of losing everything and finding something unexpected in a creature who, like him, had no place, and yet somehow found one. "I don't know what the ending is yet," Jack said. "You're living it," Clara replied, her voice soft. "That's the only honest way to write one." Snow thickened, swirling into soft spirals along the treetops. The scent of pine smoke and cold air mixed with the distant crackle of a fire inside. Greywind opened one amber eye, lifted his head slightly, and turned it toward the woods, not out of yearning, but instinct. The forest still called to him, but he no longer answered it as home. Home was here. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ear, murmuring, "You still dream about them, don't you?" Greywind licked his hand once, then laid his head back down. Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a photo, unframed, slightly bent at the corners. She handed it to Jack. It showed the three of them, Jack on the porch stairs, Greywind beside him, and Clara behind the camera, her reflection faint in the cabin window. "I want to frame that one," she said. Jack looked at it a long time. "You think it'll last?" Clara smiled. "If it doesn't, it was still worth finding." That evening, the three of them sat together inside the cabin. Jack typed slowly, not for an audience, but for himself. Clara sorted through her final prints, packaging them for transport, and Greywind dozed on the rug tail, twitching occasionally at sounds only he could hear. Outside, the snow deepened, and for the first time in a long while, no one waited for it to stop. Sometimes miracles don't come with fanfare. They arrive quietly in the form of a wounded wolfdog, a man who had lost everything, and a woman brave enough to stay. Greywind's Mercy is more than a story about survival. It's about healing, about the wild learning to trust, about people learning to forgive, and maybe, just maybe, about how God places second chances in the unlikeliest places. Jack didn't go into the forest looking for redemption, but it found him anyway through the loyalty of a creature the world had cast out, through the courage to stay, through the grace of a snowy night when silence meant you are not alone. In our everyday lives, we rush past moments like these, a gesture of kindness, a word of encouragement, a hand reaching out. But they matter. They are the soft miracles, the ones that don't shout but change everything. If this story moved you, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in the power of second chances in the quiet ways God reminds us we are loved, type amen in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and may God bless you and your family with peace, purpose, and compassion.